Thank you. Hello. Sarah Brown here from the Australian Department of Industry, Science and Resources, and thank you very much for joining us so early in the morning here in Brno, but also, you know, around the world with our online people. And, you know, this session was put on especially, I think, for the Australian time zone, the kind of Asian time zone, and we really appreciate people in person coming here so early to take part in this session. So today's session is about challenge-based frameworks to enhance national research infrastructure's impact, and we've got a range of wonderful speakers from around the world, and we'll start off with presentations from each of the speakers and then we'll go into a panel discussion. So to start with, I'd like to invite Susie Robinson, Executive Director of the Australian Plant Phenomics Facility, to provide her presentation on this interesting topic.
Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, good evening, and good whatever else to everyone else around the world for joining. Thank you very much for having me here today. Just by way of introduction, as you can tell by the accent, from Australia. The Australian research infrastructures operate under the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy, or NCRIS, in a similar vein, I think, to other models around the world that invests in nationally significant research facilities. They are accessed by public and privately funded users from both the Australian community, but also we service a good deal of international clients as well. Around the country we have 24 different facilities. They are delivered through around 400 delivery partnerships with different universities, research organisations and so forth, and we have a great many expert operators who are the engines that make the places run. I'll come back to the importance of those people in a little bit. The Commonwealth Government has pledged to invest around $4 billion into our Australian infrastructures over a decade or so, and we're partway through that at the moment. We do know that those investments leverage quite a lot of further co-investment, getting around $1.40 for every dollar of government investment there. Just very quickly, I'm one of the 24. The Australian Plant Phenomics Facility is the facility I lead. We operate a variety of infrastructure that's both controlled environment and out in the field. A collection of pictures there just to give you a little bit of a flavour of what we do. We service industry very closely. We're one of the facilities in Australia that has got a very close working relationship with industry, as well as right through to discovery science, basic science. The Australian system, like others, works on both a cyclical basis, where we have a roadmap that is developed and released, which provides, if you like, the priorities and the key signals about what the country thinks are important for investment into infrastructure. That then gets actioned through a research infrastructure investment plan. We have a new roadmap every 5 years. It obviously reflects prevailing government priorities, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well in a moment. And also, of course, acknowledges what's changing over time in terms of the research frontiers, but also wanting to make sure that it is uniquely Australian so that it both reflects and speaks to our particular areas of research excellence, and that it's got a uniquely national context to it. The most recent roadmap, you can see a picture of its front cover there, was released earlier this year. The consultation that led up to the development and release of that roadmap was very comprehensive, and it was very much a sort of top-down, bottom-up process where the government undertook a structured process that engaged very broadly, both internationally and domestically, with industry, with the research community, the state and territory governments and so forth. And then, if you like, from the bottom-up perspective, facilities like mine and others have been busy working through design plans, decadal plans, have clustered up with our users and provided briefings and input into the process. There were some really fun mechanisms that we used to gather and toss ideas around about what was important. We had some online ideas jams where people were able to post suggestions and comment and build, and so that the thinking was finessed and refined over time. The roadmap was then released in draft form for a period of consultation and feedback, and then the final. So it was a lengthy process. We were all very pleased to see the end roadmap when it came out. If you like, we all know now what our blueprint is that we're all working towards. As I mentioned, there's a 5-year plan, so if you like, we're in an operation mode, but coming towards the end of that, so facilities are beginning to think in light of that roadmap. Do we need to look at additional delivery partners? Do we need to change up the geographic mix of where we're putting our infrastructures and the specific technologies that we're investing in? So this time round, Australia went with a challenge-based framework in its roadmap. There was some careful thinking as to the reasoning behind that. I guess a lot had changed in the world, it goes without saying, since our last roadmap back in 2016. For starters, the extent to which digital infrastructure and the question of data has just become so ubiquitous and important has really come online and been important to think about. Much of the research that's done, and indeed the infrastructures themselves, are far more interdisciplinary. A lot of the technology that's invested in is very cross-cutting. So you might, for example, in my area, we invest in a lot of sensor and imaging technology, but so do many other infrastructures around the country. We have a national imaging facility, for example, which also invests in high-end imaging equipment. So we were beginning to see, in an organic fashion, a lot of clustering of NRIs, either around some of those technology-specific areas or around delivery areas, in other words, solving particular sorts of problems for researchers. We were hoping that the challenge-based framework would also provide some great links and hooks for international collaboration to make it really clear, here are the stories that Australia is interested in, here are the key problems and challenges that we are trying to solve with our infrastructures. Similarly, like most parts of the world, our publicly funded research system is very much interested in translational industry engagement and end user real world impact. And so again, the challenge-based framework was considering how can we use that approach to try and improve our connectivity to industry. So I guess there were 4 key things that were taken into consideration here, and of course I have to say my perspective here is as one of a infrastructure leader. I was involved in the process, but not from, if you like, inside of the tent. But the first point that is important to make was how did the challenge areas get chosen? As it turned out in the Australian context, what was a key driver for that was some very significant efforts on behalf of government to improve Australia's sovereign manufacturing capabilities. COVID, I think, gave all the world a wake up about what you can do very well on your home shores and where you're dependent on others. We had for quite some time seen the decline of manufacturing capability right across its breadth in Australia, and so there was a whole lot of policy settings looking to address that. So the challenge areas were chosen to align in real lockstep with the Australian government's modern manufacturing strategy. That created both some opportunities, but also a couple of challenges. For example, one of the challenge areas in the manufacturing strategy is medical products. That's the sort of sole challenge in that strategy that speaks to the area of medical and health sciences. So I'm sure you'll all appreciate that there's an awful lot that happens in that sort of health and medical area that you might not neatly say fits as a medical product. That takes a very broad definition of medical products at the very least. So there were some really interesting debates and discussions at a national level about the choice of those challenge areas and whether they give the best scaffolding. There was also consideration of the different sorts of infrastructure categories, which we're all familiar with, whether we're an observing type of infrastructure or a measuring or a fabrication, the computing and the linking elements. We also looked at the connectivity to our scientific excellence and those scientific domains that are important for us in Australia. In Australia, we have those for our publicly funded research codified into a number of fields of research, and then there is also a number of clusters, for example, the earth and environment and health and medical. And then finally, as I mentioned before, the question of digital NRI, which is just so ubiquitous these days. But the key things that we've been really grappling with in Australia in relation to that have been trying to get the balance right between what I would kind of call three different things. One, white label investment, so investing into something where you solve it once in a way that can become useful for almost everybody. They may need to pick that up as a sort of white labelled solution and tweak it and improve on it and make it relevant for their own specific domain area or infrastructure, but that a good deal of the work's already done for them before they pick that up and run with it, through to sort of investment in one-size-fits-all elements, where in fact you can make some investment in terms of perhaps storage or compute or other elements that can then service everyone across the country, but also recognising that you do need to also invest in and recognise the need to have some things happen closely to the domains where the expertise lies, because although the digital is ubiquitous, the way it's used, why it's used and how it's done often needs to be tied to that specific expertise. Then sat on top of that sort of base picture was then the recognition that Australia's been investing in a coordinated way in infrastructure now for 10 plus years, and in fact longer if you look back through some of the previous initiatives that were precursors to our ICRI system. And so then there was a recognition that on top of that strong base, which you need to continue to invest in, there are a number of areas that are becoming really compelling and important where you want to invest in some step change and some enhancements to build on that base. So, for example, things like synthetic biology and all the possibilities that that represents has been picked out. Questions around dealing with climate change and sustainability are a couple of examples there. The other conditions for success that were clearly and much more strongly outlined in our most recent roadmap were on three fronts. One, people as infrastructure, just recognising that the equipment itself is half the battle. You need the people to really begin to make that value proposition come to life. And I mentioned before about the connectivity with industry as being an increasing driver, and what we're also finding is that it's really important that you have people who understand and can connect with and engage meaningfully with those various industry stakeholders that you might be wanting to serve as well. So we're asking a lot of our people these days in our infrastructures in terms of their ability to be both technical experts, scientific experts, and also to be able to engage compellingly with industry. That question of alignment and integration of national research infrastructures, so the sorts of clustering activities. Again, I within our plant phenomics facility am part of a national cluster of earth environmental sciences type facilities. So one way or another, we all have a hand in looking at and supporting science and activities that relate to the health of the planet. And so we group together in order to think through both our investing strategies, the coverage that we have to make sure we can service the user base collectively well, and areas where we can actually properly connect up on specific initiatives, and there are quite a number of joined up initiatives that we undertake. So our roadmap, of course, doesn't sit in isolation. Every country's got a whole lot of interesting documents, and we're no stranger to good policy documents. But the linkage to the manufacturing strategy was a bold and a really interesting way to go. One thing it does do is crystallise investing decisions being made right across a big number of government portfolios. It crystallises how industry is thinking about the sorts of research and innovation that they're wanting to undertake and so forth. We also in Australia fairly recently released our first list of critical technologies that are in the national interest, and there's a review of that just underway at present where there's been some consultations. So you can see the list of technologies there. That document became an additional interesting benchmark comparison point for the NCRIS perspective. We're also about to revamp our national science priorities, so again it will be very interesting to see how they fall out in light of things like our roadmap and the list of critical technologies. Just a couple of quick comments around the benefits of that challenge-driven approach in practice. So I'll give them from my own domain that I know best. So the first one I'll talk about is some partnership work that we've been beginning to get involved in with the Australian Research Data Commons. The ARDC is a fellow infrastructure who's responsible for matters relating, as you'd suggest, to data and digital, and picking up on the clear signals around the different challenge areas. There was a challenge area of food and beverage. The ARDC has been working through a process around a food security challenge and had workshopped with the Australian research community where are some opportunities for coherent investment into that. So again, with our interests, we've been able to partner up with that and bring a coalition of interested parties around how we might look at some data platforms to help characterise and monitor crop performance around the country. The rural R&D corporations is another example I'll just give. In Australia, all of our farmers in all the different industries that they operate in have to pay a levy out of the profits they make from their farms. Those levies get clustered up under things like grains, horticulture and so forth, and fund R&D programs that are designed and invested to benefit all of those growers over time. So we've got close relationships with those rural R&D corporations, and again, for example, with the Grains Rural R&D Corporation, with them being able to see so clearly in the government's roadmap food and beverage and the subsidiary more detailed points that cascade and sit under that around open source agricultural data assets, some specifics around phenotyping and so forth. They're able with more confidence to say, right, we can see this is a direction of intent from the government, we can get in behind and partner up with that. So we're very grateful to be able to kind of work very closely with them. That gets us very close then to industry and the folk who are benefiting from the research and investment that we support. So just on the flip side, there are a few challenges and risks around that challenge-based approach. So that the first one, I guess, that was given the biggest test was we've had a change of government recently in Australia. So we had this modern manufacturing strategy. The roadmap had been very closely pinned to that. So there was a bit of bated breath as our new government settled in to see whether they were going to say, yeah, all right, that still looks pretty good to us, or whether they wanted to sort of tear up those priorities and come up with something different. So as it stands, we're all green light and it looks all good to go, which is good news. But there is a certain amount of risk where you are hitching things very closely to quite specific government of the day priorities. Next point, I guess, is just that fundamental science, as we all know, can be really cross-cutting. You don't quite know where it's going to go or to what ends it's going to reach. So it's not at all easy to necessarily marry up or closely map a lot of fundamental science specifically to challenge areas. You just know they will come to pass, that they will be supporting those challenges. That gives you some risk around both dilution of effort or potentially duplication in terms of what you're doing there. So the challenge framework, I think, is a positive one, but you need to make sure that you are thinking about it and coordinating it carefully. So particularly those clustering type approaches where we can begin to say, well, we can take responsibility for this if you take responsibility for that, are going to be really important. So just quick summary. Challenge-based frameworks, I think in Australia we're all quite excited about our challenges. They give us a really good collection of topics to all unify around. They need to be relevant and resonate with your national needs, and I think the ones, again, things like food and beverage for Australia in my area is just a obviously hugely important part of what Australia is all about. it's also important, though, to recognise that you can't just look at that in a kind of column-type basis. It's very much a matrix where you then have your enabling technologies weaving through, your research concentrations weaving through, and so forth. And finally, you need to be, as always, thinking about these things in long-term horizons that are going to be bigger and greater than any of the risks that might be involved in changing political priorities. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. So I think we'll hold questions for the end when we've got our kind of panel discussion. So we'll move on to our next presenter now, please. So Gelsomina PAPPALARDO is the Director of the Institute of Methodologies for Environmental Analysis of the National Research Council of Italy and an Executive Board Member of the European Strategy Forum on Research Infrastructures. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to all for coming here very early in the morning, and good morning to all, and as my colleague said, good evening to the others on the other side of the world. And as you can imagine, and you can hear from my accent, I'm from Italy, as you said. So I will give a brief presentation on what we are doing in Europe in the European Strategy Forum on Research Infrastructures in terms of policy and development of research infrastructures in Europe. So the idea was to start from what we are doing in terms of landscape analysis of research infrastructures of pan-European level and which kind of impact this pan-European work can also have at the nation level. So I will give some examples. So we start from the ESFRI roadmap. You probably know that it's one of the major outcomes of ESFRI. The latest roadmap was published in 2021. It includes 22 ESFRI projects and 41 ESFRI landmarks. For who is not familiar with this vocabulary, landmarks for us are those research infrastructures projects which have been already implemented. And of course, the ESFRI roadmap for us is the biggest document, where is also is important for us to update the strategy on European research infrastructures. Also to improve and reinforce the competitiveness for both excellence and impact of European research, and as we are discussing in this session, related to challenges also for the society. So one of the key part of the roadmap is the landscape analysis of research infrastructure of pan-European interest, which provides an overview of all the major research infrastructures which are providing access and services for the community, mainly to conduct excellence research, but also as discussed several times, also to try to solve, to provide solution for the different challenges. It's important to have this kind of document because this gives us the idea of what's going on. And if you have this kind of information, then it's much easier to develop the optimal strategies to improve the entire system in Europe. This time, in 2021, we have adopted a more service-driven and impact-oriented approach, maintaining always the excellence science, and this is the most important principle for us. Our landscape analysis that you can find on the web, it's easy to be found on the ESFRI webpage, has three main parts. The first is the analysis of each scientific domain. ESFRI is divided in 6 different scientific domains, which covers the digit part, the energy, environment, health and food, physical science, engineering, and social science. The section 2, the second chapter, was mainly focused on identification of interconnections among the different domains. I mean, if we think to provide something for the society, I think that we cannot consider the different disciplines like in isolated silos, but we need also to to promote interconnections. And then in the last sections, for the first time, we started to give more examples on the services that our research infrastructures can provide and the impact that they can have. And we decided to focus on three main specific areas. One was related to the COVID crisis, what the research infrastructures were able to do to react promptly. And the second part was related to what the research infrastructures can help and how can be relevant for the SDGs. And the third part was related, the third area was related to the digital transition, which is becoming always more important, as we have seen also from the previous speaker. So there is an impact, of course, at European level, but also at international level, because with ESFRI, we are working a lot also at global scale to reinforce the international cooperation. But at the same time, there is also an impact at the national level. Today, we were discussing also the national roadmaps. For us, it means the national roadmaps that we have in the European countries, which are very much related to the work ESFRI is doing, because we have this kind of reflection in the national roadmaps, which is related to using the same ESFRI scientific domains, the same definition and vocabulary, but also it's a combination of European priorities, also with more local and national priorities. Interconnections, again, play a key role, and the services. And do not forget the impact at national level, because we have different countries with different also needs. So just briefly, the Italian example, this is what how we produced our national roadmap. It's a systemic approach, which is based on EU priorities, taking into consideration the European research area, ESFRI, of course, and also the national priorities. It's always based on a sort of survey where all the research performing organizations and universities are contacted, and then all the research infrastructures project that have been received are evaluated with respect to benchmark criteria that are those, I don't know, okay, it doesn't matter, that you can find on the right side, scientific excellence, but also socioeconomic impact and so on. In this way, in Italy, we identify 131 research infrastructures, which are categorized in three different categories. With high priority, we have 74 research infrastructures, medium are 35 research infrastructures. And based on this is important, the national roadmap, because in Italy, but also in many other countries in Europe, is the framework where a specific call can be launched to support the development, implementation of research infrastructures. And this is in the framework of the National Recovery and Resilience Plan in Italy. There was a call of more than €1 billion for research infrastructure. This doesn't happen every day, so this is why I put it here. It's, so I think it's a big responsibility for us to have this kind of projects developed well. And there was also, for the first time, a call which was related to technology infrastructures for innovation. So these are the results, because the call was launched December last year. There was the proposal were submitted in February, and there was the evaluation, the negotiations. Now we have 27 funded projects for research infrastructures for about €1 billion, which are divided in the 6 ESFRI domains, from digit up to energy, and with the different instruments which are related to upgrade of existing research infrastructures or new research infrastructures or thematic networks, also to force and to foster this kind of interconnections as well. For the technology infrastructures, this was the first call that we had in this, for this topic. We have 24 funded projects, and with the multisectoral approach, there were technology infrastructures focused in different areas, from the digital transition to environmental energy transitions, health technology, advanced materials, and so on. And this is just an example of a very big project that will start the 1st November this year. because it's a thematic network. It includes 22 research infrastructures. I forgot to mention that most of these research infrastructures, of course, are national nodes of European research infrastructure, so are not isolated. So this will also reinforce the cooperation in Europe, and not only in Europe. So there are 22 research infrastructures starting mainly from the environmental domain, but also including research infrastructure from the health and food domain, because there are things which are closely related, and together also with research infrastructure from the physical science and engineering, because we also need such kind of expertise. This project will stand for 3 years, but the idea is it's mandatory to have it at least 10 years of operation. But with this kind of ESFRI research infrastructures involved, we have a much longer term vision. Of course, we expect, I don't want to read everything here, but we expect a wide scientific, economic, and societal effect of the project in terms of attracting people, new scientists, attraction also of capital, because what is important is when we go from the European level to the national level, we need also to consider what is really the impact on the specific territory. And in this case, with this project, we have the distribution all over the country, from the north up to the south. And just the summary for the last slides, just to show how much the fact that in Europe we are working together in ESFRI to have this kind of research infrastructures on European level can leverage, have a strong impact on at the national level, also with big goals. So cooperation is important, and we know as ESFRI how much is important to have a good landscape analysis. So we have already started to work on the next one that will be much more user-driven. So we are supposed to contact directly stakeholders and users, and this will be published by the end of next year. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that insight into the relationship between the national work and the ESFRI work. I think it was really helpful to understand that. So we'll move on to our next speaker. Ronald Roberts is the Deputy Chief Officer for Research Facilities at the National Science Foundation of the USA. Thank you.
All right, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. You may not be able to tell from my accent that I'm from the US. I am from the US via the West Indies, the Caribbean, specifically Grenada. So I bring a sort of different perspective to things. But thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. I was asked to address the unique way in which we do infrastructure in the US. And as I thought about this, and I listened to my colleagues this morning at the presentation, there are lots of commonalities in what we do. We do not call it road mapping, but we do plan for infrastructure. We get into strategic planning. And when you think of what road mapping accomplishes, it is a strategic process for determining the actions you're going to take, the sequence of those actions, and the resources that are needed to move projects from a vision to a reality. We do that. We do that every day. That's what road mapping is all about. So, however, in our context, in the context with which we do it, it is influenced by certain factors that are in common globally. For example, a lot of different stakeholders that you have to satisfy. And then for us in the US, there is another significant factor that influences it. It's our budget process. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about those factors and how they influence what we do. So here we have the two factors, the budget cycle. We have an annual budget cycle. And more importantly, we have this clause, this act in the federal government that we're dealing with that is called the Anti-Deficiency Act. Basically what it means is that we cannot spend monies that we do not have. We cannot commit the government to future activities, basically. And that limits what we do, but it does not deter planning. It does not impede our ability to plan for research infrastructure. The second thing are the stakeholder organizations. There are lots of stakeholders we have to please with this, including from the Office of the President to all of our stakeholders across the US. To give you an example of the environment, the context, the landscape that we are dealing with, here we have 17 federal departments and offices led by the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the National Science and Technology Council that have a stake in this process. In addition to that, we have input from the academic community, professional societies, industry, and international partners. So it's a very complicated landscape of stakeholders, similar to what most of us have to deal with. However, our approach to research infrastructure starts with a common definition. There must be a definition that everybody buys into, that everybody sees their reality in, basically. It has to align with the requirements of the different agencies, etc. So this is not something that's led by NSF, but NSF has to see, the National Science Foundation has to see its ability to realize its mission, accomplish its mission in whatever definition is presented. So this is the definition here that was presented in the 2021 National Strategic Overview of Research Infrastructures in the US. Whatever approach we take, that approach has to be flexible and inclusive, and the products must be comprehensive and agile. In addition to that, the rationale for infrastructure has to be enduring, robust, and unassailable. Basically, the argument for infrastructure, as one of my colleagues already mentioned, cannot be solely a political argument. It has to be an argument that when there are changes in administration, when there are changes in interest, infrastructure needs to be resilient to those changes. The plans for infrastructure needs to be resilient to those changes. So, in our case, we have both top-down and bottom-up contribution to the process. The top-down contribution is basically managed by the Office of the President, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the National Science and Technology Council. We also, and typically the working groups that are assembled by these organizations are made up of agency staff, so staff from across the federal government. So that's where you have the government input. Then we have non-governmental input, where we have specific advisory committees that give advice to the federal government, composed of experts from across the US. And then we have another type of input from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine to have broad community input from academia, industry, etc. So they pull on that expertise, and the challenge is to sometimes meld those inputs together. But we prefer to have that challenge than not having it. An example to illustrate how this occurs is ALMA. It's an astronomy facility located in Chile. The planning for this activity, for this facility, straddled 3 US administrations from its inception to the beginning of operations. Thus, that resilience that is needed in planning for infrastructure. ALMA also demonstrates how community consensus is brought into the picture, right, through these National Academy surveys, even studies showing that the requirements are still being met, basically. And finally, international partnerships, which is a very important aspect of all of this. So ALMA demonstrates all of this as a facility. So in terms of R&D planning, one of the things we do, what we want to come up is, what are those guiding principles that the agencies can use to guide the development of their research infrastructure roadmaps? And the strategic plan came up with these goals here. I'm not going to read them, but these are the goals. And the national guiding principles: national security, economic competitiveness, privacy and IP concerns, fostering collaboration, adaptability. And it also identified these 4 key opportunities for US RDI, and typically we don't just refer to research infrastructure, but research and development infrastructure. Forgot to make that clarification at the beginning. So these are the 4 policy opportunities that guide the agencies in the development or in the planning for research infrastructure. The result is to have a landscape of discipline-specific, from discipline-specific to more integrative, from standalone to more distributive infrastructure, provisioning a more robust and secure cyber infrastructure underlying these infrastructures, and identifying RDI needs and understanding for underserved research communities. I think we believe strongly that this should not be done as an afterthought, but it should be proactively pursued. How do these infrastructure service underserved communities, underserved research areas, etc., that this should happen? Collaboration is an important part of this process also. Interagency with state agencies, with industry, and international collaboration also, as exemplified by these quotes from the 2021 document. The importance of international collaboration. So as you see, there are lots of commonalities here. We don't call it road mapping, but we do road mapping. And I hope I've given you some insight into some of the challenges we face, but how we do things also. And I look forward to the discussion resulting from this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roland. And so in trying to fix the time zone challenges for one area of the world, of course, we've created challenges for others. So our next speaker, Maria Natalia Lisa, has recorded her presentation for today, and we will swap over to that now. She is the head of the Center for Structural Biology at CBAM, the Mercosur Center for Structural Biology in Latin America.
Hello, it is a pleasure for me to be here virtually with you to present, and I'm going to share my screen now, the CBAM, or the Center for Structural Biology from the Mercosur. Imaging biological structures is central to research in life sciences. The CBAM is a network of groups in Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina. This regional network associates research groups that work in protein science using different approaches, aimed at integrating available capabilities and infrastructures at the regional level, promoting advanced training of human resources and facilitating the mobility of scientists at the service of biosciences. 7 founding nodes, and here you can see the founders, Glaucius Oliva and Gerson Lima in Brazil, Alejandro Villa and Fernando Goulban from Argentina, and Alejandro Caso from Uruguay, started coordinating actions in 2007 to disseminate structural biology and bioimaging methods in South America. CBAM was relaunched officially in 2008 once the Brazilian agency founded its first activities, with Uruguayan and Argentinian agencies joining in shortly after. A governance scheme was later set, enabling swift decisions and transparent accountability, with CBAM's central headquarters rotating among countries. Currently, I am the general coordinator of the network. I'm based in Rosario, in Argentina, and Javier Santos in Buenos Aires is the co-coordinator. Among silent activities coordinated by the network, there are several meetings and also advanced courses in nuclear magnetic resonance and macromolecular crystallography, which kick off a remarkable extensive series of hands-on workshops, progressively incorporating more integrative approaches, especially including cryo-electron microscopy. These activities have resulted in the organization of more than 50 advanced courses, involving more than 200 invited speakers from around the world, more than 1,000 students, and approximately $1.5 million funds for training purposes. More recently, CBAM has established closer ties with ICRI, which is the European Research Infrastructure Consortium dedicated to structural biology, opening up the means to give greater access to research infrastructure in Europe for Latin American scientists. CBAM signed an umbrella mode with ICRI, establishing a collaborative partnership. CBAM has also worked in facilitating the access to dedicated research infrastructure for structural biology and bioimaging, which is very expensive, as a critical requirement for scientists to conduct state-of-the-art experiments. CBAM nodes possess equipment for structural biology and bioimaging valuated in the order of more than $20 million without including the synchrotron from Campinas. Approximately 35 missions to and from CBAM nodes have been supported to provide access to research infrastructure within the network, leading to more than 50 joint publications and a more efficient use of the infrastructure. So the goals of the network are to integrate regional capabilities in structural biology, bioimaging, and integrative bioimaging, optimizing the use of sophisticated equipment and disseminating integrative approaches in life sciences, to train human resources in key disciplines of structural biology, bioimaging, and integrative bioimaging, to provide support for scientific visits of students and staff to and from CBAM nodes, to map high-impact multi-center research projects capable of contributing to social development through the advancement of biomedical sciences, to disseminate CBAM activities and objectives, and to work together with decision makers in order to establish intelligent research and develop strategies on the fields we study. So taking this into account, our actions, concrete actions, have to do with the coordination of an exchange program for scientists and students to move from or to 7 nodes and 2 international reference centers, to co-coordinate advanced courses in structural biology, bioimaging, and integrative approaches. Operational standards are discussed and coordinated among structural biology, bioimaging, and integrative bioimaging facilities in South America to promote open user access and fair data management practices, and to perform a detailed landscape analysis of available and lucky technological capabilities in South America to inform strategic decision making for the development of life sciences in the region. Recently, we have received a grant, an important grant, from the Chance Zuckerberg Initiative Foundation. This project is led by myself together with my colleagues Alejandro Caso from Uruguay and Rodrigo Portugal from Brazil. And one very important aspect of this project is that we have highlighted that in the region, we need to develop the science and the community to understand at atomic resolution and with time result data, how living matter works, and use this information to improve the quality of life for people. Because this is very important and it has been highlighted by the recent pandemic. It is very important for us to develop this kind of ability in order to solve in an autonomous manner very concrete problems of the life of people. So in this project, we have committed to work on communication and visibility of the network to coordinate this program of scientific exchange visits. So there we are going to help during 3 years with approximately 30 visits from or to 7 nodes for data collection or for collaborative research projects. We are going to co-organize also 4 advanced international courses in cryo-electron tomography, single particle cryo-EM, protein crystallography, and integrative approaches. We also have a program to support long-term visits to centers of reference for training of staff personnel. And also we are going to work in the integration with centers outside Latin America. And this has to do with the visit of internationally recognized specialists from research centers all over the world for advice, evaluation seminars, and also for a landscape analysis. As I said before, we have established a tight collaboration with ICRI. This has allowed the co-organization of seminars in different cities in Latin America, also has provided the means for different staff staff internships, moving from different cities from INSABEM to, for instance, cities in Europe. 9 memorandum of understanding have been signed with institutions in Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. A cited funded project was started, as well as the RES-INFRA project, and also INSTRUCT has opened 2 calls for access that has allowed Latin American researchers to access European research infrastructure. So the results of the landscape analysis that we have been working in collaboration with INSTRUCT are being presented in this conference. And here I just want to highlight the main result that has to do with our need in Latin America to develop a clear strategic roadmap for structural biology bioimaging that has to be developed both at the national and regional levels. And considering this, we identify several challenges, and among them, I want to highlight 2. That, I mean, in the region, which is big and diverse, we need to be able to sit at the same table to establish a shared agenda, and with this to reach decision makers and have them working together to discuss a lot of very important matters that arise in this regard. We need one possibility, one strategy could be to try to build a Latin American research agency and elaborate a regional map within this Latin American Research Agency, elaborate a regional roadmap for structural biology and bioimaging. This would be very important for the region because we don't have a scientific agency that puts together the different Latin American countries. So this would be a very nice way to establish a shared agenda. And with that, I want to thank you. I'm going to stop share so I can say thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. And so I'll ask all the panel members to come up to the stage for the panel section. And we're joined by Maria's colleague, Leah Pietrosanta, for this panel discussion. So thank you very much. So I think there's another mic over there. So Maria very carefully presaged some of the questions we're thinking of talking about in terms of this panel. So I'll start with the first one. What are some of the challenges of communicating research infrastructure impact to an international audience? And I might start with you.
I think this is on. Great. Challenges of communicating to an international audience. Yeah, I think one of the things is to begin with, to make sure that we are beginning to talk from sort of a common vocabulary in terms of what we are talking about. And then realizing that in terms of impacts, as we look at different countries, different regions, the impacts would be measured differently. I think we have to be cognizant of that. That's also linked back to, you know, starting from a common base. But I think too that there are commonalities, and we should find what that one commonality, even if it's one, to start with, and begin with, you know, how is it impacting individuals' lives? I think one of the key things about research infrastructure is that it has to, whatever research that it catalyzes, etc., has to be researched. These activities have to be relevant to the common person out there. And if we cannot transmit that, if we cannot make that translation and basically illustrate to why they're invested, because it's taxpayer dollars in this, and if we cannot sell it to them and show why it is relevant to their everyday life, to food security, their health, et cetera, I think that if we can't do that, we are failing. But I think we need to start with a common vocabulary. We need to realize that the interest across different countries, different regions would be different. I think that's a place to start. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone have anything they wanted to add to that in particular?
Thank you. I guess I'm thinking about depends who you're talking to. So if it's infrastructure to infrastructure, to some extent maybe we have some of the language, but I'd still say that. And I've been now in the research infrastructure sort of world for about 4 years in my role. And if you asked me to give you a sort of 30-second rundown on the structures and status of infrastructure in Latin America or Africa, I'd fail miserably. I have to put my hand up and say so. That, you know, it's really easy to get embedded into your own little world and you get your head around it. And it's easy to realise how unimpregnable it is to the outsider. That we were in a session last night about a project that had run for a few years. There's a couple of people in the audience in relation to that, called the RI-Viz project, which was all about building visibility between continental infrastructures. And I think projects like that are really important, just to actually unpack what's out there, to understand who's doing what, and build those kind of personal connections, so that you then find those common ground areas. You start talking the same language. You find that you've got some shared stories
areas of what you're trying to achieve, and then you're well on your way. So I still think there is a lot more that we could be continuing to do on that front around just actually opening up the doors and just making it easier for people to understand how it works. I mean, your presentation on that interface between the Italian national and the European was really, I mean, I sat there and thought, oh, okay, that's great. I'm starting to unpack that much better than I would otherwise do. So I think there's still something in that as well.
I fully agree on having a common vocabulary or language. For Latin America, as Natalia mentioned, is a big region, is a diverse. We have a symmetry within the countries and in between the countries. So the first or the starting steps that we should follow is to sit around the table, to share an agenda, and then bring the authorities, bring the decision makers in order to work together. But we need to have a common language.
So just further to that, how do you think roadmaps or challenge-based frameworks can help you develop that common language? Can, you know, build international research infrastructure cooperation? I might start with you.
I mean, first of all, I would like to go back to Europe, because, I mean, when we say international, Europe is not international, but we still have many countries with different, different kind of needs, and within each country we also have regional governments, so different funding mechanism it's very diverse. So it's not easy, but I would say that this fact that the system is complex has forced us to work, to be seated around the table, and to build something on long term, which should stay also with the different changes of governments, not in one country, but at least in 27 different countries and so on. So it was important for us, first of all, as ESFRI, also to define the agenda and the vocabulary. So for us it's important, I mentioned very rapidly because there was not so much time, what we are doing is following the research infrastructures, the life cycle approach. So we start from the concept design, the preparatory phase, the implementation, the operation phase. And for each of these phases, we have specific things to be monitored, checked, to help the research infrastructures. And the basis is also a common vocabulary that now is it started probably at European level, but now, as I showed today, is also reflected in the different national research infrastructures, national roadmaps, and with the work that we are doing in place like that at ICRI is also trying to exchange more with the international community as well. So the vocabulary is important, but also the way how we can communicate can be different, depends on the target. I mean, this is also something that needs to be considered, and the impact, I would say, that could be different in the different regions, but the way we should measure should be the same. Because if we want to really be consistent, compare the aspects, I think we need to be a little bit more rigorous. Of course, there is a long way to do. I mean, it's not done yet, but we are making progress, and the alignment of the roadmaps are very, in the different countries are very. It's a very good result, and the fact that we have a strong cooperation with countries at international level, this also helps a lot. Thank you.
Susie, what do you think in terms of the idea of, you know, how the roadmap in Australia has perhaps helped build international collaboration? I know a lot of our infrastructures have international relationships. You know, we're part of large-scale consortia, especially around, say, Earth observation, ecosystems, oceans, all of that kind of stuff. So do you think having the kind of idea of it based on priorities or challenges has helped build that international collaboration?
Thanks. I'm going to answer that, but I'm just going to take a step back first, just broadly about that kind of the benefit of a challenge-based approach. I don't know about everyone else here, but I kind of increasingly feel like that the world and the amount of information and facts it can throw at you is just completely outstripping my little slowly evolved human biological brain. And so I sort of spend my days thinking there's information just coming at me like a deluge and I've got to sort it out. One of the things I really like, therefore, about challenge-based frameworks is they're basically stories. They're built on the premise of stories. What do we want to do? Why do we want to do it? And I think it also brings into sort of play something a bit like, again, the folk who deal with technology have realised us humans aren't sometimes great with it. So we now have a lot of this sort of, user design, user experience, user journey type stuff. And I kind of see the frameworks as a similar sort of premise whereby you can take a framework, you can take a challenge area and you can start it at its real inception around fundamental basic science. You can take it through a journey. You can work out how and where different hands might touch it and what those hands are and who they are and what they need to be doing to value add and bring it along to that next point of maturity till you get to the point where it's out there and being useful in the world. And so I think if you think about frameworks in that way and you think about that journey, then you do get that framework, coming back to your question, where you can interface with others, whether that's international colleagues or it's industry partners or whoever, investors, where you can sort of say, this is the journey where we can all put our little human brains around that. We can get excited and lit up by it because there's that, that's really important as well, just to give people something that is inspiring and motivating. But it also gives you that ability to then create the practical structures about, okay, well, that's all well and good, but what do we need? What do we actually need? What are the ingredients and components to get us there? And that's where I think then you can do your interfaces with international cooperation to say, we haven't solved this bit yet. Have you solved that? Or we want to fund this, but we can't fund it without industry coming in and supporting it, or whatever.
Thank you. So in looking at how we use road mapping or challenge-based things, what do you think are some of the benefits or in fact drawbacks of employing societal challenges in RI planning? I know, Susie, you covered some in your talk, but I guess, given that like it's not an explicit use of road mapping in the US. Ronald, what do you think in that space?
So you were asking about how
the use of challenge-based frameworks, what are the benefits or the drawbacks from that, basically, like in RI strategic planning. Because Susie highlighted, challenges around government priorities, changing, the kind of framing you're doing it in, changing too fast for RI planning, things like that.
Yeah, I think the challenges are similar in the US context. One of the things I tried to demonstrate was the diversity of stakeholders. And each of these organizations, each of these federal agencies have their own mission. Some of them regulatory, some of them like the National Science Foundation to stimulate and fund research endeavors. We don't, at the National Science Foundation, we don't do the research ourselves. We fund academic institutions, nonprofits to do the research. At places like the Department of Energy, they do the research. They employ scientists to do the research. So you have totally different takes on what should be happening and how it should be happening, right? I think coordinating all of this is a challenge. When my Italian colleague was talking about the ESFRI and the European context and having national roadmaps plus the overall ESFRI roadmap, I started thinking that's kind of how we should approach it in the US, that the agency roadmap should be like the national roadmaps, and then there should be some higher level road mapping. Maybe that's from the president's office or whoever. So it does. but in terms of challenges and how it relates to, you know, the needs of individuals and social well-being, my view on that is that we need to be proactive. The research generated, the products generated by these infrastructures should be relevant to the lives of individuals. And it can only be effective, that can only be done if it is done proactively. It cannot be an afterthought that, oh yes, we build this and then let's see how it aligns with something. We have to be proactive about this, and it cannot be an afterthought. And I think whether it's challenge-based or whatever methodology is being used, it cannot be an afterthought, basically.
So I'm just conscious we're beginning to run out of time. So is there any burning questions from the audience, or there's the ability to look on things online? So I'll just let everyone know that. Have a think about your question while I then hand to...
Yeah, I would like to continue on that, because pro and cons, I mean, it's... I think that it's important to be challenging-driven, but I think the message is also, at least in Europe, we are talking in ESFRI about research infrastructures to facilitate and promote excellent research. I mean, because we should also consider that we have a very long-term vision, something that so far is not immediate for citizens, could be in 20 years from now. So I think that we should, and also the educational and excellent research per se has a societal impact that needs to be considered. So one of the things we are doing in Europe, in whatever project in all the calls to get funded, the proposals should write down the socio-economic impact. So you should know what you have in mind. But please, it's important to be challenge-driven, but do not forget the excellence research, because this is also very important. And this is one of the main principles for us. Thank you.
No, that's great. So do we have any questions from the audience? So a mic is just coming to you. And if you could just state your name and affiliation for everyone, that would be great.
Alberto Melloni from Italy, Chief Scientific Advisor of the Commission, Research Infrastructure Resilience and Religious Studies. One question, I see that even this morning, actually we use a very common language. Everybody says that we must be flexible, inclusive, comprehensive, long vision, and so on. And the idea is that infrastructure may work like companies in the market. So the market will decide who is really flexible and who is not, who is really inclusive and who is not. And what we have learned from the recent crisis in the global arena, the climate change, the pandemic and so on, is that to wait for the market is not always wise. And so what is the measure of the adjective that we use when we say inclusive, interdisciplinary, comprehensive, wise, intelligent, bright, smart, and so on? Who is measuring and who is the meter for this type of things? Thank you.
All right, who wants to take that one? How many volunteers?
You look at me, who is the meter for that? I think this is where conversations, global conversations, come into play, right? We need to be talking with each other as to what those standards are, what's that baseline that we are measuring from. One of the things in one of the presentations yesterday, when we talk about research infrastructure being flexible and agile, that sort of thing, that database, I can't remember the specific name, but the database that was adapted from whatever its original intent was, but that flexibility was built into it, so it was adapted to deal with the COVID situation. That was an excellent example of that. So when we talk about research infrastructure being agile and adaptable, And you know, yes, they are built for one specific objective, but I think we need to be sort of thinking more creatively, sort of when we are from the inception with the underlying cyber infrastructure, et cetera, that is supporting these things, so that when we are faced with these challenges, we don't have to build something from scratch to address those challenges, but we can adapt something that's already present. And the only way I see us dealing with the issue that you raised is by global communications like we are having now, and lessons learned, and figuring out what those measures are that we are measuring ourselves against. Because currently, you know, in the US, we are measuring ourselves against, you know, what we did yesterday, that sort of thing, you know. But I don't know if my colleagues have any, you know.
I think it's a very difficult question, yeah. And it's even more difficult to find an answer. But I think it's, we should consider dynamic. I think if we agree on these kind of principles, then to implement those, to make this a reality, to be really inclusive and all the things that you mentioned, it takes time, but we should agree. If we agree, and the work we are doing at a conference like ICRI, where we put together, at least for research infrastructures, of course we cannot solve all the problems in the world, but at least for research infrastructures, to try to arrive to speak a common language, I think goes into this direction. I think that we can just close with this more positive message, even if I mean, we did not answer completely to your question, but this is a wish to continue in this direction. Thank you.
That's great. So yes, we are out of time, I'm afraid. So if everyone can join me in thanking the panellists for their excellent presentations. And thank you to everyone who joined us online, and I look forward to the rest of the conference. Thank you.